My goal in this video is to build the most difficult woodworking project ever seen on YouTube, and my 30 years of woodworking experience tells me that if I don't achieve this goal, I can simply slap a bit of paint on it and call it rustic. Striving for excellence is a never-ending chase, but after 4.5 months of grueling work, the end result of this piece has left me questioning whether or not this much effort is even worth it. Now, most furniture tends to favour the side of function over form, but this whiskey cabinet has a twist. Literally. With intense joinery, wooden curves, over-the-top details, more wooden curves, and a lighting setup that'll put you in a new dimension, this video is a product of over 45 hours of film footage and doesn't just explore woodworking at its finest, but explores the potential breaking point of the fool that thought this was a good idea. The whiskey cabinet is very much a woodworker's rite of passage. It's a piece that allows you to combine lots of intricate details into a small footprint, and in my opinion, one of the only times where the term less is more is irrelevant. The intention behind this piece is to challenge myself. The problem is, when you've been woodworking for 30 years, this becomes more and more difficult. Ordinary woodworking just isn't scratching that itch anymore, and I find myself going to greater and greater lengths to achieve satisfaction. Now, my therapist might say that's addictive behaviour, but I've seen enough epoxy tables and French cleat videos on YouTube to officially be bored. I've heard many musicians say over the years to make the music that you want to hear, so I'm going to make the video that I want to watch while building the piece that I want to build. So this piece is somewhat of an experiment. It has no client, no time constraints, and no design requirements. Purpose is to explore different possibilities and use new techniques that I haven't done before, to explore precision in woodworking while going against the usual design theories and practices. This video is my strive for excellence and the unforeseen circumstances that a construction of this magnitude can bring. Now, the material for this cabinet has been carefully considered, mostly for its colour combinations, but also for its weight. The top cabinet is made from Queensland maple, which isn't a heavy wood at all, an important thing to consider on a design like this. The colour also contrasts well with the hard maple that makes up the legs. The hard maple will provide the rigidity that I need to support the top, and you'll see later on that I use some white ash that also serves a specific purpose. A big thank you to Britain Timbers for supplying the material for this project. If you want to know more about Britain Timbers or simply just want more information on different wood species, I'll leave a link to their website below. Now, in order to understand what's going on with this cabinet, we may need to go back in time a bit. Okay, maybe not that far. Roughly 6 months ago, I used my laser cutter that Xtool sent me to create a model of this idea that I've had in my head for a couple of years now. The model had to show enough detail for me to truly understand the scale and overall aesthetic of this piece, as up until this point, it's only been a silhouette in my mind. The laser cutter allowed me to cut out each individual layer, then glue them together. This layering process is basically the same process I'm going to use when it comes to building the actual cabinet. It took a couple of iterations to get the model where I wanted, but this is where I ended up. And now that I have a physical object in front of me, I'm able to understand all the details and any potential design flaws that I may have overlooked. From this point, I was able to order my materials and begin creating full-scale templates. In fact, here are all the templates I used throughout this entire project. Okay, so back to the build, and what I'm cutting out here are the templates for all the tops of each layer. Each layer consists of 2 sides and one of these curved tops that gradually steps back, creating a staggered look on the inside, and I'll eventually carve the outside to a smooth curved shape. This might sound straightforward, but this is a fairly complicated process, as each layer has sides that are mitered to the top, but as each layer steps back, the miter needs to be adjusted to ensure that when it comes time to carving the outside, the edge of the miters of each layer line up perfectly. That sounds confusing, but this will all make sense shortly. I've had the opportunity to be interviewed multiple times throughout my career, but there was one interview a couple of years ago that really stuck out. Towards the end, I was asked where I wanted my business to go in the future, and the answer I gave was probably similar to the answer that most makers would give. I want to make what I want, how I want. The interviewer's response was, "Oh, so you're after the Holy Grail." We both laughed, but that comment made me think. Maybe I was being unrealistic, but I always thought that over time, and with the right choices, that I would eventually get to my dream of making what I want when I want. But that response of the Holy Grail infers that many people try to do this but don't succeed. And that got me thinking, shit, what am I doing? I felt like I was wasting my time. If this is what I want, then I need to start now. That conversation, as well as some uninspiring projects I was working on at the time, forced me into figuring out the choices that I needed to make that led me to this point, where my business is now essentially a video production company, where I don't have to rely solely on client work, thanks to all of you who watch the videos I create here on YouTube and on Patreon. This really is one of the first pieces I've made with no parameters and no deadline, where I get to build what I want, how I want. And although this is the dream, it wasn't long until the downsides began to show themselves. This is what I meant earlier, how each miter on each layer needs to line up perfectly. If they don't line up, then it will be noticeable when the outside of the cabinet is carved. It's also important for the inside of the cabinet, as each layer is staggered and these miters need to line up properly. Speaking of which, here's what needs to happen to the inside of the cabinet. I have 12 layers in total. Each layer needs to be set in 10 millimeters from the next to achieve the look that I'm after. Now I could go and create a template for each layer, but that's going to use a lot of material. So all I'm going to do is ensure that I get the first layer perfect. Then I'm going to use that layer to transfer the shape to the next layer, then the next layer and so on. If I were to have made a template for each layer, then I'm stuck to that exact shape. So if there's any slight variation from one layer to the next, then it will be noticeable. The method I'm using allows for any variation because the shape of one layer affects the next, so you will never see any of these differences. This plastic ring is one of the table inserts from my spindle sander, and it's going to allow me to trace a 13mm offset line. This is purely so I have a line to cut to on my bandsaw, so I can remove as much waste as possible before moving to my router. I've also added dominoes on each layer. This is obviously to ensure everything lines up properly when it comes time to gluing the layers together, but laying out these dominoes was a massive task in itself, as placement had to be perfect. Anyone who's carved wood knows that any hidden fixings create a huge potential for mistakes, as you run the risk of carving into the fixing and exposing it in your finished surface. That's why having a diagram like this to refer back to makes life a lot easier. A router with a straight cutter and a guide bushing will allow me to copy the exact shape of the first layer to the second layer with a 10mm offset. I can now use the same method for the second layer to the third layer and so on until all the layers are complete. This method is the perfect way to get the exact look that I'm after, which was actually inspired by the ceiling of the concert hall inside the Sydney Opera House. This layering effect is really going to take on a life of its own once I introduce the lighting, which is going to help shape a completely new look to the inside of this cabinet. As I mentioned, I've been working on this piece for 4.5 months, which explains the lack of activity here on YouTube. Now, from the outside, it looks like I don't post very often, but I actually upload 2 videos per week, as well as a dedicated topic video each month on Patreon. This entire build has been fully documented as it was happening from the very beginning of the build to the very end, with over 50 videos including behind the scenes footage and quick tips. Unfortunately, this YouTube version is cut down for time, but I do have a 15-part, 6-hour-long video series covering every single detail of the build with no voiceover or music over on Patreon. Now, understandably, not everyone wants to join another subscription service, so I've made the full series available for a one-time purchase without any subscription. You can preview each video before deciding, but if you're asking yourself throughout this video, how did that happen, or why did he do that, or where did that part come from, it's all in the extended cut linked below. I have to say a big thank you to all of these amazing people who have made a project like this even possible. It really goes to show that Patreon is no longer just a way to support a creator, it's a learning platform, offering insights into the professional woodworking world. I don't do ad reads at this point because I prefer not to be beholden to others, and if I'm going to be paid money by viewers, I want to be providing value. Just as a client pays me for a custom piece of furniture, a patron pays me for my woodworking knowledge, business insights, and a deep dive into projects like this cabinet. To be honest, without a deadline, I'm kind of lost. Because there was no consistent push to get the piece done, I found that I was falling into phases of being motivated, then not motivated. I was becoming complacent, which led to many careless mistakes. I've always said that it's important to push yourself on every project, to develop your skills and learn new lessons related to woodworking. But on a project as complex as this, I was finding that I wasn't just being challenged on my skill set or learning new techniques. I was learning a lot about myself and my healthy and unhealthy relationship I have with my career. I guess when you're used to having one project take a maximum of 3 to 4 weeks to complete, you get used to shifting focus onto something new as one job ends and another begins. Any mistakes, boredom, or uncertainty can be pushed aside or forgotten about once a piece is done. Kind of like a reset button. But after building the same thing for months on end, all these things continued to greet me as I'd open the shop doors every morning. There was no escaping. I no longer had my reset button and I wasn't able to move on from mistakes. I had to push through any lack of motivation and face all the uncertainties that I had inevitably created for myself with a build that's so complicated, which, to my surprise, opens up a floodgate of self-reflection, as this inability to move on had forced me to take a deeper look into who I am, what I do, and why I do it. So we're about to get to the legs portion of the build, which is where things really begin to get complicated. But before I can get to that, I need to completely close the cabinet off, and as you can see, I've created a cutout in the front. This will all make sense a little later, but it will help to hide the lighting, the wiring, and the battery. The bottom of the cabinet is made from an MDF panel that I've veneered, and it's glued to the front layer only, then slides into grooves that I've routed into the cabinet sides and back. This will allow the cabinet to expand and contract if need be. Also, you may have noticed earlier that I drilled out a bunch of holes on each layer. This is purely to remove as much weight as possible and stop the cabinet from being top heavy. One of the key features of the X-Tool P2 is this pass-through feature. The automatic conveyor feeder allows indefinite lengths of material to pass through, which is perfect for creating the long leg templates, as the laser feeds the material in through one direction as it cuts one side of the leg, then changes direction as it cuts the other side. Now, I will admit I was skeptical of this feature, as the more moving parts there are, the more chances of inaccuracies, but the leg templates came out perfect. This cabinet has 2 identical back legs with a subtle curve from top to bottom, and it also has one front leg that is slightly tapered, so that's 3 legs. The 4th leg gets a little wild, but we'll get to that later. Now, the curves and tapers of these 3 legs help to add in the right look I'm after for this piece, but it's going to make the joinery trickier than usual, as I'm not going to have a straight line to work off when it comes to cutting the wedged mortise and tenons. But before we can get to the intricate joinery, I have to make possibly the weirdest rail I've ever made. In order to save as much material as possible, I want to get all the components to this rail system out of this warped board, while also trying to keep the components as thick as possible. The problem is due to the amount of cupping in this board. If I were to start milling it as one whole piece, I would have to lose a lot of thickness. The other problem is due to weathering. It's a little difficult to see the grain, which is important as each of these components are curved, and I need to know where the grain is in order to achieve the most amount of strength. So by simply figuring out where the grain is and drawing straight lines on both the board and the templates, I can mark out where everything needs to go, then break down each component. Notice each component allows a straight line to pass the entire length. This isn't by accident, as I've designed each one of the components to allow for this. If the curves were any tighter, then I run the risk of having cross grain, which will be a weak point, and that isn't good, especially given the responsibility of this rail system. After all, it brings the entire cabinet together. The 2 back legs, the 1 front leg, the wild curvy 4th leg, and the top cabinet will all meet here. One of the main intentions behind this build was to use more hand tools, and in all honesty, due to the intricacies of these joints, hand tools are really the only way to hone in the perfect fits. But that doesn't mean I couldn't use my domino to at least hog out the waste for each mortise. Now, as I touched on earlier, due to the curves and the angles of the legs, each shoulder is slightly angled, and because the tenons are wedged, each mortise is also angled, creating a very confusing situation as there isn't a square line to work off, but these guide blocks help to achieve the correct angle for the wedged mortises. I've actually been planning this build for quite some time now. In fact, part of the reason for building my Rubo workbench when I did was so it could help me build this whiskey cabinet. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, I don't know how I lived without this thing. It actually encourages me to want to use more hand tools, which is great, because over the years of running a business, I feel like I've developed bad habits and have come to rely on power tools and machinery to get the job done. But thanks to this bench, my hand tool confidence has increased to a point where I trust my hand tool abilities almost as much as I trust my machinery. So far, my favourite features of the bench are of course the leg vise, as well as the split top. I'm quite surprised by how much I love using hold fasts, but the clamp for holding unusual shapes has to be the best feature. It's actually designed for a cabinet like this, and you'll see it in its element later. Now, up until this point, the legs have been the most complicated part. Getting all the joinery correct wasn't easy, but unfortunately, this is where my complacency got to me. After the dry fit, I accidentally dropped the cabinet off my bench and just so happened to dent the most delicate parts of the legs. But this wasn't the worst thing that happened. I was pressed for time and worked late one night. Tired and over it, the worst time to be making creative decisions, and in an effort to fix the dents, I decided to start shaping the legs in a last-minute design change, and this is where everything went wrong. So this is the first version of the legs. The second and completed version is now sitting to the left of me, and these legs are now considered a complete failure. You can see one of the dents that happened on the front leg, and I tried to fix it by sculpting it a little bit, and that clearly didn't work. And then my other bright idea, which all made sense in my head at the time, was to taper the back legs from front to back, and then to try and fix the damage from dropping this leg, I sculpted the top. Then once this new shaped leg was put together with the rest of the cabinet, it just looks too flimsy and the cabinet looks too top heavy. So this was a huge mistake. I didn't film any of this because I was just so over it at the time. It was a risk, and in all honesty, I kind of feel like it was gonna fail from the very beginning, which is maybe why I didn't film it. But I'm now happy to say that the second set of legs are done. I've realized it's about time I put my big boy pants on and get over this and continue with the rest of the work. If you watch my walnut bed video, you've probably seen this theme box before, which is going to allow me to bend these maple strips into the curved shapes I need for the bottom rail. And these forms are going to help get the shape I need in a process called bent lamination. I actually have a detailed 27-minute video on Patreon all about this process, as well as a 20-minute video all about steam bending. The links are below. Now, the steam allows these thicker strips to bend into position without breaking, and the form gives them the shape they need. But the steam box introduces moisture into the strips, and before you can glue the strips together, they need to be fully dried out and acclimate back to the workshop. That's where a drying form comes into play. Now, drying forms can be just as elaborate as the bending form, or they can be as simple as nailing some lengths of MDF to the workbench. This MDF will maintain the shape of each maple strip and allow airflow all the way around. Once dried, I can glue them together using a hard setting glue. This is black dyed veneer, and you're going to see quite a bit of it throughout the remainder of this build. I'm using it purely as a visual accent, as the black colour works well with both the hard maple and the Queensland maple. Now, once the curb rails are dried and cut to shape, I can create the mortise for the loose tenon that will eventually fix the bottom rail to the legs. I've harped on about making mistakes quite a bit in this video. I guess it's still something that I can never really shake. If you can't tell, I'm quite hard on myself, and mistakes have always been somewhat debilitating to me. Although I am a lot better these days, I've most definitely found it difficult to accept failure as part of the process. But I know I'm not alone in this, as it's something I've spoken to many woodworkers about, and the obvious conclusion is if you're not making mistakes, then you're not learning, which I do agree with. But I also think that if you find yourself getting really upset over a mistake, then chances are you're onto something that you truly care about. And if you can harness that properly, you'll be onto a good path. If you can figure out how to turn that into a career and support you and your family, then you'll live a good life. I mean, you'll work harder than you've ever worked before, and at times you'll doubt your choices. But at the end of the day, it'll make you happy, and every mistake will be worth it, as long as you can continue to move forward. And in an effort to help me move forward from my mistakes, I've decided to share them all, including the biggest and possibly most careless mistake I made just hours before finishing this cabinet. One that I couldn't bring myself to show in this video, but if you are interested in my mistakes, my likes, dislikes, and design choices, I've created a free 45-minute review video all about this cabinet. You can check the link below. I know I'm coming across a little whiny in this video. I'm sure lots of people would love to be in a position where they can build whatever they want. I feel incredibly fortunate to have creative freedom at this point in time, but I feel like outlining these negatives not only allows me to process what's going on and how to eventually fix it, but also hopefully some of you watching can gain something from this experience. There's a few reasons for using wedge mortise and tenons. The obvious is that it's a strong joint. Once the wedges are glued in place, there's no chance those joints are coming apart. Another reason is because I wanted the challenge. Like I said earlier, these were very complicated due to the curved and angled leg. But the other reason is simply because it looks good, particularly because I'm using that dyed veneer again. Like earlier, I used the West system, which is a hard setting epoxy. I've used this because it dries clear. Lesson learnt though, using a thin epoxy with a vacuum pump isn't a wise choice, as the pressure of the pump can pull the epoxy from the joints, even though I wrapped the veneers in plastic. Thankfully, the joints weren't starved, meaning there was still enough glue between each veneer layer to hold everything together. So I can move on to making the wedges. Now there's a number of ways to do this, but in this scenario, I feel the easiest way is just to create an angled MDF bed to feed through my drum sander. This will at least get me close to the angle I need, then I can adjust the fit with my block plane. I was a little concerned about inserting the wedges into the tenons because those wedges, although only a veneer, have a hard glue in between the layers. And that hard glue might be harder than the maple, which means if the wedges don't go in perfectly straight, then I run the risk of denting the edges of the mortise. So I've temporarily stuck on some MDF strips to help guide the wedges and protect those mortises.
Which worked just as I'd hoped. Now, if you're enjoying this video and you're keen to see more videos like this, then please consider liking and subscribing.
Now there's clearly nothing normal about this piece, so a normal wedge mortise and tenon isn't going to cut it. I'm going to have to make these a little more unique with a template and pattern bit. This is where the cabinet really begins to come into its own element. The point where it's going to differentiate itself from any other piece of furniture. The curved leg, which all starts with making my own veneers from white ash. I'm going to sandwich the ash with an outside layer of hard maple and an inside layer of something we haven't seen yet. Hopefully something that will help blend this crazy curve into the rest of the piece and make it look like it's supposed to be there. Thankfully, due to the helical head cutters I have on my thickness planer, I'm able to get these veneers thin enough without getting too much breakage. But keep in mind that whenever you thickness thin material, to always use a false bed on the planer. You can see I have an MDF board on mine. This essentially removes the bottom rollers from the thickness planer and gives thin material a solid surface to slide on. Just ensure that you wax the surface first. Once again, I'm using Techniglue, a hard-setting, thick epoxy that won't cause any issues in the vacuum pump like the thinner West system. This is a messy and time-consuming process, and the long open time of the Techniglue is essential for a task like this. You may have seen me use this technique in a past video where I built this bench seat. So thankfully I have more experience this time round, but the nerves are still running high. Now I could be overdramatic and say that I only have one shot at this, but that's not true. If I screw it up, I can do it again, but that means wasting all this material. Plus I'd have to buy more material and go through that very long milling process again, and I hate doing things twice. As I mentioned, the white ash is sandwiched between a layer of hard maple and this veneer, which is highly figured English sycamore. This is to help create a little bit of difference between the inside of the curve and the rest of the maple legs, but more importantly, the intense figure of this veneer will help to blend in an idea that I have for the cabinet doors a little later. Once the layers are glued, they're placed inside a vacuum bag, then over to one of the more crucial parts of this process, the form. It's important to be inspired no matter what craft you do, to look up to others whose ideas, techniques, and skills make you want to be better. One of those people for me is Joseph Walsh, an incredible designer maker from Ireland who has most definitely inspired me to push myself and try new things. In fact, it was his work that inspired me to get into vacuum pressing in the first place, which is made possible with a vacuum pump. The one I use is by VacuPress, who did send this to me at a discounted price. The reason why I use this specific brand is because of its auto-cycling feature, which turns off once it's reached full vacuum, which is a necessity on a task like this. Now, this process might look pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of experience and knowledge behind making it work. If you're interested and want to dive deeper into this bending technique, I've put together a 45-minute video where I break down everything in detail. I go over things like design parameters, how to make your own form, material choices, machining requirements, and the tools and products you'll need. There's also a longer version of this glue up and clamping process where I explain exactly what's happening as I go. There's a link with a preview below. Now, out of the entire build, this point right here has to be the most satisfying part. Plus, it's where I finally get to use my favourite clamp on my workbench. As a business owner, it's sometimes difficult to take a step back and just take it all in. I've found in the past that I tend to work on momentum, always looking forward to achieve what I need to right now, which in all honesty is understandable. Any business owner will know that there's always a million things to do in a day, which is overwhelming. No wonder we can't just sit back and revel in our accomplishments. But when building a sculptural piece like this, you're almost forced to slow down and chill out. The only way a piece like this works is to stop what you're doing and just look at it. A lot. You'd be surprised by how many hours I've just spent staring at this piece, trying to get all the curves to look right from all angles, which in all honesty has been one of the more difficult things about this cabinet. Every part of this curved leg has a different angle and a different radius, so having it positioned even just a few millimeters one way or another can make it look entirely different. Not to mention trying to figure out how to even fix the curve to the other legs. After staring at this piece for what seemed like days, I managed to settle on creating a second curve to attach to the first curve, which then attaches to the bottom rail. Then, I've created two other fixing points using more black dyed veneer that I've laminated together in a plywood style layout, giving me a rock solid material to attach to, as there will be some force added to these fixings. The simple act of just sitting in silence and taking it all in is the secret ingredient to a sculpted piece like this. Yes, I can create perfect templates and I can stay awake late at night imagining how it's all going to turn out, but the best decisions I've made on this cabinet are the ones I've made with the piece directly in front of me, where I can see it from all angles. It's the feel that you get when looking at a piece like this that drives the best creative decisions. It's easy to overlook, but working with wood is a great reminder to just stop overthinking, chill out and enjoy yourself. I'd originally come up with a door design for this cabinet months ago. I even ordered the special veneer before I'd ordered the rest of the wood. But after seeing the whole cabinet in front of me, I realised it wasn't going to look as good as I thought. Also, I kind of screwed up and was forced to go in a direction that I didn't really want to. I talk more about that in the free video below. But this has been a real interesting lesson that I've learnt on this piece, as there was a number of unforeseen issues in this build, and I was concerned that I was now designing to fix problems rather than designing to make it look good. But there was no way that I would have come up with this design if I hadn't run into the issues that I had, which I'm actually quite grateful for. Now, the last thing I wanted on this cabinet was shaker style doors. After all, everything else on this cabinet is unique, so why would I want to include something as common as shaker doors? But this theory ended up being a big mistake, one that I would have personally never noticed until the piece was completed. You see, while I was still trying to figure out how to solve my little screw up with the original door design, I decided to go to the footy with some friends. During halftime, I showed my friends some progress photos of the cabinet. The photo was the top cabinet sitting on top of the legs with the curve roughly clamped in place, no doors at this point. I was expecting a positive reaction, but instead I got a look of confusion as each friend asked, "What is it?" It was at that exact moment that I realised. In an effort to make this cabinet look unique, I've removed all familiar reference points that tell people, yes, this is a cabinet. So of course the initial reaction is going to be one of confusion. This is when I decided that because of its familiar characteristics, the shaker style door was actually the perfect option for this cabinet. I mean, it's still going to be unique, but a shaker style door nonetheless. What I've been doing up until this point is creating some angled infill pieces that will eventually get attached to the inside of the door frame. But to create some extra feature, I want the grain to run in a different direction while still maintaining its strength. So I've made up some veneers and glued them to the long grain lengths of Queensland maple. I've then added in more black veneer that I've pressed into the shapes needed to achieve the look I'm after. Woodworking is one of those things where you can work for hours, days, weeks, or even months on a single component, where all that preparation comes down to one single action that could totally ruin everything. From this point on, there's going to be a number of those moments, ones where I question if it's even worth it, starting with this bright idea right here. I don't think I've ever seen this before. If I had, I probably would have approached this idea with more confidence, as I know if it would have looked good or not. But the idea stemmed from one of my miters shifting slightly during glue up, leaving a small gap. Unfortunately, when you make a gallery style piece like this, the work is overly analysed and criticised. Anything other than perfection is now unacceptable, and miter joints seem to be one of the first thing people's eyes go to, so this little screw up opens itself to harsh critics. So in true fine form, my way of fixing it is to potentially screw up days worth of work. But in my opinion, this is one mistake that I'd be happy to make again. Granted, this isn't your traditional shaker style door, but as discussed earlier, it does provide a familiar feature. One that people will hopefully look at and realise this weird looking thing in front of them is actually a cabinet. But the door frame now needs a panel, which is made with an MDF substrate for stability that's been edged with solid wood where the edges will be exposed. Now the back veneer is simply made from my Queensland maple stock, while the front has been specially ordered, and there's a chance it's going to upset some of you guitar makers out there, as this veneer was intended as an electric guitar cap, but it's certainly going to add some incredible feature to the front of the Whisky Cabinet, and the figure is going to work well with the figure from the English sycamore that I added to the curved leg earlier. And as soon as I'd recovered from the stress of cutting into those miter joints, I go ahead and do this. Now, understandably, grain is going in different directions with those infill pieces and the veneered panel, but my view behind this is there won't be enough movement from the small pieces to cause issue. But as mentioned earlier, this whole piece is an experiment, and this cabinet is going to be with me for an extended period of time so I can see how it holds up before selling it. But for now, I'm officially at the point where I can start finishing this cabinet off and inch closer to the one detail that I've been dreading since the beginning of this build. About 2 years ago, I asked myself, how amazing would it be to make a leg that wrapped around a cabinet, then turned into the handle? It's been pretty cool to actually see that vision come to life, but it's at this point where I realised I need to stop coming up with these ideas. Because this moment, right here, will go down as one of the most stressful moments of my career. Thankfully, because of this build, my confidence with hand tools is at the highest it's ever been. But that doesn't change the fact that one tiny slip up here could mean weeks of fixing and remaking. Understandably, I could have just cut a straight line, but that would make the join look far more obvious. Plus, I guess I did ask for a challenge. And just like that, with one last cut, all the stress is gone and I can finally move on to finishing this piece, which means finally getting to the lighting, which has been carefully thought out from the very beginning. In fact, the entire internal design was created specifically for the lighting effect I was after. Ever since getting into photography and making videos, I've been obsessed with lighting and how it can be shaped to create its own environment. You can completely change the mood or feeling by simply changing the lights. So the idea was to create a mood as soon as you open the doors to this cabinet. I mean, granted, this is a whiskey cabinet, so that mood might be, let's get wasted, but hey, I don't judge. Now, this piece is intended to be an artwork that is also a usable piece of furniture, and the last thing I wanted was for a cord to be sticking out the bottom. So it was important to have the lights run off a rechargeable battery. I go into more detail about this setup in the free video linked below. And just as another annoying reminder, if anything wasn't clear or you want to see more detail, it's all shown in the 6-hour, 15-part video series linked below. I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed every second of this build. Yes, I wanted a challenge, and yes, this is by far the most difficult piece I've ever made, but I feel like that's come with some downsides. This piece is a representation of a new path for me, one where I've gained a little more freedom in my career to build the things I want. The Holy Grail, some might say. But I can't help but feel a sense of relief now that it's done. Months of hard work and dedication have left me feeling drained. The journey to completion has been one where I've not only questioned my abilities and whether or not I can pull it off, but I've also questioned myself and why I push so hard on things. Is it even worth it? I've been striving for freedom in my work for decades, but oddly enough, that freedom doesn't feel very free. Being able to make every single decision, however I want, feels more like a burden, where most of my days were spent figuring out what am I going to do today. One thing I've learned about myself is that too much choice hinders momentum, and I need momentum to maintain my creativity. But hey, this is what I wanted, a challenge, to explore a piece with no set time frame and see where it takes me. The goal I set months ago is now sitting in front of me. Yes, it's had its ups and downs, but I've learned more than I could have ever imagined. I now understand the level of detail I'm capable of and the thought processes in order to achieve it. I now understand better ways to access my creativity and how to maintain it. And I now understand how to manage mistakes, sort of. Looking back on it, I did have fun. The mortise and tenons, the curved bottom rail, the precision of the top cabinet, and of course the curved leg. But to me, I think the best part was bringing people along for the journey. If it weren't for the long list of names you saw earlier, then this piece would have never come to life. Their support, positivity and curiosity is what pushed me forward when I felt like giving up. I guess the question is, would I ever build this again? Absolutely not. Do I want to push myself further and build something even more complicated? Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see.